Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Zaheer Fakir, who is an international climate finance expert with over 30 years of experience in global negotiations and development. A founding member and former co-chair of the Green Climate Fund, he has played a key role in shaping the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and UNFCCC finance discussions. He is also the Chief Director of International Governance at the Department of Environment, Forestry, and Fisheries, and serves as Senior Advisor to the UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Energy, and Sustainability Department. He's joining us today to discuss recent developments in climate finance and more. Thank you so much for joining us today, Zaheer. It's truly, truly an honor.
Most welcome.
Yeah, I guess to begin and maybe, introduce listeners to what it is that you do, can you explain what it is that you do? And, you've had a long career in international climate negotiations. What first led you into this field?
It was just by chance that I got into this field, unfortunately. I never intended getting into this. I was more into the arts and things like that. But I'm no longer the head of the international division in South Africa because I resigned some years back. But what I basically was, when I joined the Ministry or the Department of Environment in South Africa, I was head of the international division, which covered not only climate, but everything multilateral related to environment and everything bilateral. And part of my task, apart from working domestically, internationally, I represented South Africa in the negotiations and specifically focused on the issue of finance. And then in the course of working in that field for a number of years, I sort of grew into a position where I was also one of the lead coordinators for the African group, and then later became the coordinator for the G77 and China, which is the group of the developing countries. So partly my job was to coordinate the positions of the group, and in the negotiations, I would be the one speaking on behalf of the group, engaging in negotiations and supported by then the other groups in the countries and that. Apart from that, I was working on many of the climate funds, serving on the boards of many of them. So things like the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility or Adaptation Fund or the Climate Investment Funds in the World Bank. Partly not only just working on them, but I was involved in the design of many of these funds. So first designing them and then being elected to the board and then co-chairing the boards and that. And those funds are largely designed at providing financial support or technical support to developing countries in order to either finance projects around dealing with mitigation work, where you're looking at either avoidance or reducing or eliminating emissions, or adaptation work, where you're adapting to the impacts of climate change. And so, that's by and large what I've been doing And then also negotiating for South Africa bilateral agreements or securing financing for projects and things like that. Most recently, I think what probably may be of interest is up until the Baku COP, I was together with Fiona from Australia, the co-chairs of the NCQG on the new collective goal. So we did a lot of the groundwork for the last 2 years that culminated in the decision being taken in Baku on the new collective quantified goal.
No, I definitely had some questions about that because that's super awesome. Before we get into that, a lot of our listeners are likely students or just beginning in their environmental career. I guess some of them might have questions about your educational background and whether or not it's had a continued influence on what you do today.
Absolutely not. I think maybe I'm not like some people who have their career path mapped out for them. My career path from beginning has been just a chance opportunity and then taking me down that road. So academically, I was never brilliant in school. I was more into sports and partying and things like that. Just by chance, when I finished my university degree, which was a Bachelor of Commerce degree, I majored in commercial law and business economics, although my passion was more for architecture and art. So, and I just got a job in the Department of Trade and Industry, in which I was dealing with international trade. And just by chance, I was selected to be a diplomat. So I was the South African economic representative to Germany. And then I was sent to Sweden, came back to South Africa, and then took another job in the Ministry of Environment. at which point in time I did not even know that there was something like Climate Change Convention. Was asked to set up an international division, did that, and lo and behold, I just got into this world, and for some reason, people believe I'm some kind of finance expert in that. So to say to people out there, I think it's good if you have, let's say, academic background, but even if you don't have an academic background or experience in this field, I'm an example of somebody who didn't do anything in the environment sector, but managed to find my space in that. And I think for people, you'll find a space and you'll find your pathway, and nothing is sort of planned that you're going to know where you go. You're always coming up in points in your life where you come across the crossroad and you decide to choose one road, and that shapes your life. And that's what shaped my life, So that's how I got to where I am. I think the most important thing for me was I grew up where my parents couldn't afford to send me to university. And so I got support from the community in which I lived in to actually go to university. And so that kind of sort of motivated me to going into this area where I'm, sort of passionate about supporting others or giving other people opportunities, because I was given those kind of opportunities. So, yeah, so that's pretty much, why I got to where I am today in that job. And that's what drives me when I do my work.
I'm sure a lot of listeners, including myself, will really appreciate hearing that. I guess in the past few years, what have been some of the biggest challenges in mobilizing long-term climate finance for developing nations that you've encountered?
The world has changed in the sense that for many of the people don't realize that in the traditional sense of the word, and this now goes back in history, many of you were not even born at that time, maybe. In the 1970s, there was something called development assistance, where there was a realization that developing countries needed support to actually develop, and developed countries would provide that kind of support. That gave rise to something called the ODA, if you're familiar with ODA. And then in the 90s, there was the realization that we were doing harm to the environment. You had a major summit in Rio. Emerged out of Rio came the various conventions, climate change, biodiversity, and that. And there was a realization at that point in time also that we were doing harm to the environment by pumping out solar CO2, etc. And as a result of that, there was a need for collective action. But given that there was also the fact that the large responsibility for much of this was developed countries, they had agreed that they would provide support in it. And so that evolved over a period of time. And that's why you find that, for many developing countries, they are doing work domestically, but in order to have greater ambition, it requires support in that. And that's where the finance agenda, comes in. So it's not about financing what you're doing domestically, nor is it about financing what you're doing from a development perspective, but rather financing that incremental cost. So a simple example would be, if I was living in a country and I needed to provide energy to my people, it's something that is my responsibility as a country. And I have various options available to me. And let's say the only option for me is a fossil fuel option, build a coal power plant. And that would cost me a certain amount of money. And I was going to spend that money coming out of my tax resources. But through the convention and that, what funds were created were saying, well, listen, why not look at a renewable option or an option that's much cleaner? Yeah, the option that may be much cleaner may require additional resources. So you were going to spend X amount of resources, we'll top it up. And based on what we top up, you'll be able to do a renewable option. And with the renewable option, we derive global benefit. And the global benefit being the avoidance or elimination of emissions. So that's the basic principle of how the support works in that. You're providing support to developing countries to be able to derive global benefit. And so that's the finance agenda. And there was an obligation in the convention, in the articles of the convention, in which developed countries committed to providing this kind of incremental cost. But over a period of time, some countries started saying, well, you know what, the world has changed and there's no longer this divide between developing and developed, and we cannot be carrying all the burden, etc. So you had already manifestation of that when the Kyoto Protocol came out. And some felt it was unfair that why is it only that developed countries are having to pay and others get a free ride? Not that they do get a free ride, but that's the idea. And so over the period in time, you've had the situation where support has been diminishing, kind of access has been diminishing, the kind of nature of the support where you were getting before grant money, now you're getting loans or concessional finance. And then there's complications with that because it leads to greater amounts of debt. Not everybody can get access to it. And the problem is today, probably the most acute you would find in terms of climate finance. And that has manifested itself in the actual decision in Baku in the MCQG. If you read the decision, you will find is a fundamentally different approach to support than what was there during or pre-Paris. And so when you hear the terminology mobilization, many of the listeners may feel that when you say something on the lines of, oh, developed countries will mobilize, it doesn't actually mean that developed countries will give you money. What it's basically saying is that I will give some money to maybe a financial institution, and on the strength of that money, the financial institution will leverage other money, and hence I have mobilized. So to a large degree, whenever you're talking of mobilization, the component of what you're getting from a developed country is much less than what the total amount is, and to a large extent, developing countries are actually contributing to that mobilization figure anyway. And so, many of the funds like the Global Environment Facility works that way. If you want to do a project and you want to get, let's say, $1 from the Global Environment Facility, I have to demonstrate as a developing country that I'm putting anything from $5 to $7 towards that project in order to get the $1 that the fund will give me. And so, the $1 developed countries might say that, well, the $1 has leveraged or mobilized $7. So in reality, we've mobilized $8. And that's the complication. I think many people don't realize in the negotiations, if you just read the media and that words do matter. This is the one thing I learned, and a good thing that I did do English and that in school, that the use of terminology makes a very big difference. And if you go and analyze the decision in Baku, you will find that on the face of it may sound, oh, well, we know that we're getting this money and all of that. But when you start deciphering the text, you actually find it's a very different message that's coming out. So it is very interesting, but it's also something that a lot of the general public don't know. So, and often I find that the media are very blasé about it. So take the 100 billion. The 100 billion wasn't an obligation on developed countries to actually give you 100 billion. It was an obligation for them to mobilize 100 billion. So, it's not that, and the devil is always in those details.
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you for kind of discussing those details, because that is something that certainly when I'm reading it is hard for me to really, understand and know initially. Yeah, and I guess we talked about some financial institutions and tools that have been used to, I guess I don't know, mobilize or lead to some of that funding. How can developing countries navigate complex international funding mechanisms, some of which you've been a part of, like the Green Climate Fund and the Climate Investment Funds?
The Climate Investment Funds is a very different animal to what the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is actually what you would call an operating entity of the financial mechanism. So when we agreed to the convention, in the convention, when you read the convention, there's an article in the convention which says there's a financial mechanism. So the convention will have a financial mechanism. And then you designate funds to be the operating entity of that mechanism. So that fund, like the GCF, is supposed to provide the support for the financial mechanism. And it operates on the basis of a replenishment. So every 4 years, the fund would be replenished. And many developed countries will say, well, it's not an obligation, but technically it's an obligation on their part to replenish it every 4 years. And the money that you have right now in the GCF, let's say, when you had the replenishment was 12 billion. But you would note with the election in the US have decided not to fulfill their pledge. So of the 12 billion, roughly 4 billion will not materialize. How these funds work is that, you have a board comprised of both developed and developing countries. The fund is, because it's an operating entity, it gets its guidance from the convention. So parties to the convention have the ability of giving the guidance to the fund. And then the fund, what the board has, the board comprising of a group of individuals from the parties themselves, would determine the policies, programming, how you access money, etc. And so for a country, in order to access the money, it's the same for every other country. The difference comes in the kinds of conditionalities that gets placed in that. On the Green Climate Fund, there's no conditionality of co-financing. So unlike with the Global Environment Facility, where I have to put co-financing to get, in the Green Climate Fund, I can access money, but there is this added sort of requirement that you need to leverage some other money. So you need to go and find some other money around that. And then depending on the nature of a country you are in that, they would also determine the conditions by which you get the money. These days, most of the money comes in the form of concessional finance. What concessional finance means is that if I go to a normal market and go and borrow money, the market will charge me a certain interest rate. They will tell me how many years I have to pay it back, etc. Well, these funds, like the Green Climate Fund or the World Bank or the others, they provide concessional finance. What that means is that they give you a much lower interest rate. They give you a much longer period to pay it back. You could pay it back maybe over 40 years or 30 years, depending on whatever terms. And they give you also things like grace periods. So once you get the loan, maybe for the next 10 years, you don't have to repay the loan. But so that's the meaning of concessional finance. It's a difference between what you would get in the market and what you would get in that. But many countries, for them to actually mean it's debt at the end of the day. You know, if I'm already having debt, now I have to take on more debt to deal with climate. And this then sends you in a spiral. And if you look at the NCQG decision, it also talks about the disenablers, about exacerbating debt. The climate finance should not exacerbate debt. What that means is that you're sitting with debt, you take on more debt to do climate work, and now you are just spending most of your revenue that you're getting from tax to service the debt. Which means there's less money for other priorities like health or education or things like that. These are some of the challenges that many countries also find, that they have challenges in accessing funds. Now, part of it is maybe the lack of capacity to be able to structure projects or that. But also another part of it is that depending on the size or the type of country you are, if a project comes from that country, sometimes the countries are small countries that don't have the ability of leveraging other money. You can't go and get other people to borrow money or put money into an investment and that. And so some of the board members, if you're a board member in a developed country, let's say, part of why you're putting money in the fund is this ability to mobilize and leverage. If I'm doing one project and my leveraging potential is much higher than another project, I would favor the other project. So often you would hear that small islands or least developed countries struggle in terms of getting access to finance. It's much more complex than that. It's not just the fact that, okay, because you're a least developed country, you're not going to. It's about the ability to leverage money. And it's also the return on investment for some countries. You know, if for $1 I'm getting 100 tons of emission, and another place for $1 I'm only going to get 10, I'm going to go where I can get 100. And so this is partly also what has happened to the support, in that it's become more and more commercial in its approach. And a lot of the funds like the GEF and the GCFs and the World Banks and that have been getting pressure from their shareholders to do more with less. So you don't see the replenishments increasing, but they expect you to do even more than with $1 than that, which means how some of the business models are like the World Bank, that because they are AAA rated banks. What a AAA rated bank means, I'm sure you're familiar with that, is that they have a good credit rating and they have strong balance sheets. And because of that, they can go in the market and they can go borrow money. And because they're AAA rated and strong, they can borrow money much cheaper. So when they borrow money, that allows them to then lend out much more money to countries. But because they've borrowed the money at a certain rate, they have to recoup that interest also from the country in that. So this is what's happening these days in that. And you would find in the NCQG decision, there's a part in the decision which talks about greater amount of public money coming from the operating entities. And that there's the aspiration that the amount of money going out will be threefold.
Mm.
What that means is that operating entities are expected to present 3 times of what they're getting in their replenishment. The question is, how are they going to get that? If I'm not putting more money in there, how are you going to give out 3 times more money? Which means they have to look at things like going in the market and borrowing money. And that for many of the developing countries, the challenge you have is when you go into the market, is that they would look at the country and they would say, oh, but you have a very high debt, or you have big political risk or that. So the money that you can get in the market comes at a very high cost. And that's why if you look at the NCQG decision, they're talking about the cost of capital. How can you, for a developing country to do a project, you might end up having to pay interest of, let's say, 10, 15%. But if Denmark were to go in the market, or Germany would go into the market, they might end up with an interest rate of 0.2% or even 1%. This is the challenges that developing countries are having. You're not getting more money being provided. You're getting less money coming from developed countries. There's a greater expectation that the funds would dish out more money, leverage more money, and this is the consequence that developing countries fall into the spiral. For them to develop and develop in a green way means incurring more debt. But the more debt I incur, the worse situation I get into, and that means I have a less opportunity of getting money in the market. It means also I have to forego spending more money maybe on health, spending less money on education, or somewhere there. So these are the kind of things. That's why if you look in the NCQG decision, they talk about things about exacerbation of debt, cost of capital, transaction costs, and all of these kind of things. Because the NCQG is supposed to also try and eliminate these kind of disenablers. And so given all of this complexity, how do you expect a small developing country to actually do something? And sometimes the challenges that you face, when you're going and you're dealing with an urgent situation, you can't wait 2 years before you get funding for that.
Right.
One of the reasons why you had, coming out of Dubai, this big push to have the loss and damage fund. And the loss and damage fund is a little different than the other funds. It is also an operating entity, but that fund was created in order to support developing countries because we are now experiencing extreme climatic events. How does a country recover from an extreme climatic event? The floods in Pakistan. Farmers lost their crops, their land, and everything. How do they recover? And so part of the reason or rationale for this fund, loss and damage fund, was to support developing countries in addressing the economic and non-economic losses. So it's unlike the GCF or that, where you're actually doing a project. So these are the suite of things and with less action happening, more and more money is going to be spent on those kind of things of recovery. And if you're not, so it's a vicious cycle. Take the whole issue of the island. They can be spending a lot of money on doing adaptation measures to deal with sea level rises or what. But if we're not dealing with the climate emission reductions, the weather is still going to get more and more extreme. And all that investment that you have done into measures to build resilience just gets washed away or destroyed in another storm. And so that's more debt they have to incur, as well as having to deal with the economic losses and that. And this is a serious challenge. I don't think people fully grasp or understand. And if you look at the NCQG decision, the NCQG decision has 2 parts. It's an aspirational goal of 1.3 trillion and a 300 billion goal by 2035. But I led the Work on the Standing Committee on Finance, where we tried to do a quantification of what would be needed in order to implement countries' NDCs. Then only roughly 40% of the NDCs were quantified, and that 40% was already at 5 to 6 trillion. If you look, it may sound ridiculous in numbers, but if you're needing 5 to 6 trillion a year just to try and implement your NDCs, and your aspiration is only 1 trillion, you have a shortfall of 4 trillion, which has to come from somewhere. And then there's the expectation that these developing countries will also contribute to the 1.3 trillion. It's a very difficult field to be in, and it's getting more and more difficult because globally today, you're finding that more and more countries are actually reducing their international aid and support. There's the expectation that developing countries would mobilize more domestic resources or the private sector. Um, you in the private sector is there to make money. They're not a charity business. Then they would be in the charity business. So developing countries have it really difficult going forward, even notwithstanding also an NCQG decision in Baku and that, because a decision is a decision, but the real effectiveness of the decision is how we implement it. And that's going to be extremely difficult in this current climate.
Yeah, and I was just about to ask about that. I guess, like, what in your mind do you think needs to change in global climate finance negotiations to make funding, be it accessible and equitable? And I guess, what role do private sector investments like play in that, if at all?
I think that, one of the big challenges we have is that we created funds like the GCFs and the others to be funds that are catalytic in nature. And by catalytic in nature, I mean, these are the kind of funds that are there to support developing countries in actually buying down risk and things like that, because that's a big sort of hurdle for many of the private sector. If I'm going to invest in something, is my investment secure? Am I going to get a return? And the funds that you have today are supposed to be able to buy down that risk or take the first loss. In case something goes wrong, they will take the loss so that you don't. The unfortunate part is that these funds are dependent on contributions from developed countries, from public money being put in there. But if we're not scaling up that public money, the reality is that they are not going to be able to support the countries in actually leveraging the private finance. So, it's very rich to say, yeah, well, we don't have the money, there's no public money, go and leverage it from the private sector. But the public money is critical in allowing you to actually leverage from the private sector. And so I think at some point in time, we need to change in the fact that we're not actually dealing with finance, but we're dealing with a situation where if I'm a developed country going into a negotiation, my main priority is to make sure that I have the least amount of obligation, And from the developing country side, they're looking at how can we get developed countries to actually fulfill obligations. And that's so you're not actually addressing the actual finance challenge. Right. You're dealing with another thing and that's why if you follow the negotiations, you'll always see this issue about, oh, you got to fulfill your obligation. And the reality is that if you go back to the ODA target, which was done in the 1970s or somewhere, till today, we've never achieved that target. And that's 50 odd more years. I think roughly only probably 4 or 5 countries ever reach the target of 0.7% or exceed it. It's very easy for us to make these commitments and make these pledges and things. It's very hard to actually fulfill them. And there's no consequence if you don't fulfill them. And today people are also not really scared for public opinion. I think at the end of the day, also, it's developing countries to actually also look at how they, the reality is that you can't also be just waiting for somebody to fulfill your obligation. You need to be doing and taking measures domestically to look at how you can. And so sometimes there are measures that you can do. Sometimes it's also just simple policy changes. In some countries, just a simple change in a policy can catalyze a tremendous amount of investment into that country. And you're finding now and more countries are now investing a lot more in things like renewable energies and things. There's a lot of development happening in Africa where once before people had said, it can't be done in Africa. So you're getting a lot of renewables happening. You're getting a lot of work done on green hydrogen and all kinds of investments. The thing is, you need to build momentum around that. On the private sector side, I know that the challenge I always say is that, well, we don't have bankable projects. We can't find bankable projects. And on the other side, developing countries are saying, well, we have bankable projects, but nobody's interested in that. So it's also to some degree how you bridge that. I think also you need some companies or private sector That's going to be a bit more bold risk, because if you don't get the ball rolling, what is the quote? A journey of 1,000 steps begins with the first one, right? And if you don't start with the first one, you're not going to be on that path to that.
Very true.
So I think it's a collective effort. The climate process and climate finance is a collective effort, and it should be in that way, in the negotiations, a collective effort to actually address it, rather than a very sort of confrontational one where I'm defending not giving, and the other side is trying to get you to give. There's some positivity. A lot of funds, you see, there's a lot of work happening in a lot of countries and that. And, because of the work, the cost of renewables have come down. It's not as expensive as before. But, for transitioning, for countries to transition, it's not just a question of putting up a plant and everything is solved. And that's why you would find that over the last few years, the emergence of the topic of the just transition in the climate discussions. How do you transition, and in a way doing it that you also think about the social consequences of that? How do you ensure that people who might lose their jobs find alternative social support structures? Because we did the exercise when I was still in South Africa, and just closing one coal power station, it's not just the 1,000 people that are working in the coal power station. It's an entire community of 300,000 people, because the coal power station has people working there. They have families. Families are dependent on the stores and food and everything else. So one power station kind of runs a whole community in that. And if you are going to do the transition in that, you have to do it with that consciousness in the mind. But how do you deal with that? Because you're getting people supporting families, people supporting kids going to school, universities, and all of that. All of that needs to be factored in. So it's not just, people say, oh, well, it's very easy to just put up a renewable plant. You should also remember that if you're building a coal power station, you're dealing with providing energy of around 1,000, 1,500 megawatts. If you put up one concentrated solar power plant, most of them are either 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts. So you need to ramp up 10 of them to replace one. And it's not just you're going to close down and put up a plant. Many of the issues is that where these plants are best suited to be, where you have the best sunlight, and that is maybe not on the grid. So you need to spend a lot of money in terms of transmission infrastructure to get these things onto the grid. Then you got to also look at whether the system that you have running your energy is able to deal with solar energy coming in, which is not sort of consistent, irregular. So you need grid stability. It's a very complex thing. And I think sometimes, in the media, or people simplify it to such a degree that you believe that, it's just a simple thing. Why can't they just, this fossil fuel thing, and just put up solar and wind and that? It's not that simple as people make it out to be. So, but these are all the challenges that the climate change agenda is trying to address, which maybe 10 years ago we were not talking about. I don't see it as, many people will say it's grim. We have these conferences every year and nothing really happens, and the challenges still remain. But if you go and look over the 10-year period, you never had things like the Green Climate Fund. You never had hundreds and millions of people now benefiting from those Green Climate Fund. And so there's some positive things that have happened. And the challenge for us is actually just to build on that momentum, rather than, focusing on what is not working, but rather looking at how we make it work. And so I think right now, if you look at it globally, everybody's concerned about countries that are not fulfilling obligations or pulling out of agreements, and that, rather than dwelling on that, you should be looking at, okay, how do you make it work then? How do we still, because climate is an existential threat. If we don't address it, it will address us in some way or the other.
Yeah, and I guess also, I hate to go back, but just to clarify for listeners and define some things, can you talk about what the ODA is briefly, and also what you meant by banking projects? Because I was mildly confused by that.
ODA means official development assistance. That was the 0.7%. So what was agreed through the UN process is that countries would allocate 0.7% of their gross national product or their gross domestic towards development. And the development was towards supporting countries in education, health, and any of those kind of things. after the Rio conference in the 90s, when you came up with the Convention on Climate Change and Biodiversity, you would hear developing countries talking about new and additional funding. What that meant was that the funding for climate should be over and above the 0.7%, because the 0.7% was set out for development assistance, for health and that. Climate was a new challenge that came and needed to be additional to that. What countries simply did was they just incorporated the ODA into climate, and so suddenly climate became ODA and ODA became climate. And the reality is they didn't fulfill any of this obligation. You had another question about project?
Oh yeah, banking projects?
Bankable projects, okay.
Bankable, right.
Yeah, it's a terminology often used, bankable projects. What bankable projects really mean is that if I have a project and the project is so good that it's going to make money, then it's bankable.
Gotcha.
And that's the wrong term to use in the process, because why you're having a situation where you're not having a lack of money is that because the projects are not bankable. If they were bankable, you'd have tons of investors ready to invest in that.
Yes.
And that's why you have the funds, the operating entities and the World Banks and all of these other funds whose core objective is development and not commercial. Their job is to make or translate these projects into bankable projects, to do what is necessary for those projects to be able to attract the investment from the private finance. So that's the reality. So private finance is saying we don't have bankable investments. The projects that are there for them are not bankable because they have what they call things like hurdle rates. If the project return is below a certain level, I'm not going to touch it. It's not financially viable. So somebody has to step in there to make that project attractive for a private sector to actually invest in those projects. And that is the role in which the climate finance that you're talking about in the climate negotiations, but the incremental cost stuff and that is what that finance is there to do. But what's happening is that finance is being removed or diminished, and they're saying, well, replace it with the private finance. But the private finance is not going to come in and make projects bankable. They want to finance bankable projects. Yes. So this is the conundrum that you have in the process. The means to making things bankable is being removed, and you're expecting somebody else then to step in and finance the project. This is what the raison d'etre of, or the core objective of funds like the Green Climate Fund or the Climate Investment Funds. I haven't talked about the Climate Investment Funds, but one of the successes of the Climate Investment Funds is the renewable energy projects in Morocco. When I was on the board and when we designed the fund, must have been about 12, 15 years ago now, one of the first projects that we financed was a project in Ouarzazate in Morocco called the Noor project. It was a concentrated solar power plant. If you go to the Ouarzazate today now, that project has spawned into hundreds and hundreds of megawatts of renewable projects happening there. That was the beauty of the climate investment funds, to be that first maverick in testing and taking the risk of doing that. Had we not done that in that time, we may not be in the situation where Morocco is today with renewables and that. And that's the beauty of these funds. But unfortunately, on the boards, many of the countries that put money into the fund are scared to do this kind of projects because they're scared, okay, it's taxpayer money, and let's say we do an investment and the investment goes bank, belly up. The first thing that's going to be in the media, oh, Germany took X amount of taxpayers' money and threw it down the deep, dark black hole. And this is the thing. When you're getting money in these funds, we talk of risk appetite. These funds are supposed to have a higher risk appetite than commercial banks or something. And, in simplistic terms, what the risk appetite is if you went to the bank and you said, I wanted to buy a car. And the bank would look at you and say, well, what job do you have? How old are you? How much assets do you have? And then based on all of these things, they would think, well, is it worthwhile us giving her the money to buy a car or not buy a car? The banks have a less of a risk appetite than another. What happens these days is that if they have a low risk appetite, Then you go to somewhere else who might have a higher risk appetite, but the cost of the higher risk appetite is they charge you triple the interest and they want you to pay every month or every week. And so, this is the same example as what you're finding in the funds that's supposed to have a high risk appetite. The people are putting money in that funds are preventing them from having the high risk appetite. On the one side, as a negotiator, you say you want to support the most vulnerable and you want to support the least developed countries and that. And then on the other side, as a shareholder of the fund, you make it so difficult to actually support these are some of the things that we need to work with and change. And that's why, these funds play a very crucial role in catalyzing, as I would say in the beginning, a lot of the action. Yet a lot of the countries and that have a very sort of negative view of many of these funds. And that's why you're finding that these funds are struggling to actually get replenishments. Funds like the Adaptation Fund that does brilliant work struggle to get money because the mechanism they put in place for the Adaptation Fund to get money never materialized in the money because they use the market mechanism. They use the CDM process and they use the levy. So the Adaptation Fund, becomes a fund that is completely dependent on charity. And every year, where countries have some extra money, they give the Adaptation Fund some money. Has a total of only roughly about $1 billion or more than $1 billion. So over 10 years to do work that is supposed to help countries deal with the negative impacts of climate change, be it sea level rise, be it erosion, and this is the challenges that these funds have. And people are just, having to deal with these kind of situations. Adaptation is the one area where we're also looking at how we get private sector to be more engaged in that. Because many of the adaptation projects are not revenue generating projects. If you do a renewable project, you're going to sell energy, you're generating revenue, it becomes profitable for a country. But many of the adaptation projects do not generate revenue. So private sector thinking, well, should we really be putting money in something like that? So it becomes more and more difficult for us to be innovative in a way of finding ways of getting funding into adaptation. And that's why you find that from all the climate finance, between around 70% of climate finance goes towards mitigation and 30% is going towards adaptation. If you look at the actual climate finance, only probably 8 to 10% of the money is grant money. The rest of the other money is all loans, climate finance, of which many of them are market-related loans, so not even concessional loans. I mean, these are the hard realities and the facts of what what countries are dealing with. So when you see the numbers of money that's supposedly out there, you'll see reports and they say, well, there's 1 trillion for climate finance. Yes, there's 1 trillion, but people can't access that money because the money is too expensive. There's too much conditions. It's going to increase their debt burdens. And so you have endless problems. And that's why what we try to do in the NCQG is not only try and mobilize the money, but mobilize the money in a way that it doesn't address or doesn't exacerbate these issues, that countries don't face those kind of challenges that they're facing currently with the finance. And if you look at reality, much of the climate finance money that is out there, most of it is spent in the developed world, not in developing countries. So yes, they can show big numbers, but those numbers are not flowing into the least developed countries or the small islands or many of the developing countries themselves.
I just have to say I appreciate you keeping this conversation super accessible. I have kind of a question about another funding mechanism coming up, as well as, I have another one about the NCQG. But before we move into that, I wanted to talk about your experiences, in your work with the African Ministerial Conference on Environment and the African Union. What key priorities, I guess, have emerged for climate finance in Africa? In African countries?
Much of what I've been talking about, priorities in Africa, there are greater challenges when it comes to adaptation for many countries, because many of the countries in Africa are not high-emitting countries. You have a few, South Africa or some of the others that would have, but in totality, the total amount of emissions or Africa's contribution to global emissions is only about 2%. That, so for an African country, the big challenge is the issue of uh, also adaptation in climate finance world. The other issue is that for African countries, it's not just a question of energy transition. And by that, I mean, people are thinking that, okay, well, all you need to do is just remove what you have, the dirty energy, and replace it with clean energy. A big challenge in Africa is the issue of also energy access, where a large, vast populations don't have access to energy. So it's not just a question of putting in more, they just don't have the access to energy. And so not having access to energy, you're having all kinds of burning of wood or some kind of thing and having many health consequences in that. At the same time, for African countries also, it's a question about how does climate fit in within the broader development agenda. It's not climate for the sake of just climate, but you're looking at it from a perspective of development. So if you look at the Paris Agreement itself, it states in there, I believe it's in Article 2, is that the work that you're doing in terms of emission reductions or building resilience is that it's in the context of sustainable development. So what African countries are looking at is that in doing mitigation or adaptation work, it's also about how do we create employment opportunities? How do we empower people? How do we empower women? How do we create domestic economic opportunities out of it? These are all the challenges that, for African countries that are, and this then manifests in the kind of finance that you are looking for. So take a country like South Africa is looking at energy transition. In the first instance, the country suffers from what they call load shedding. I don't know if you ever heard the word load shedding. But what load shedding means is that the energy generated in South Africa is not sufficient to meet the energy demands of the country. And so that puts the whole energy grid on a stressful situation because the grid is always operating at maximum. So, if you take it like a gas thing, if the gas is always the steam thing is always at the highest point. So in order to prevent a total collapse of the energy system, they have what they call load shedding. So they have different stages in which they mean that for 2-3 hours of the day, certain parts of the country will be cut from electricity. So it happens in all cities, you get a schedule. And depending on what stage you are, if you're on stage 4 or stage 6 means something on the range of 6 hours a day, you're not going to have energy. And they have different times in order to maintain. So for a country like South Africa, which is largely coal-based energy, now to come and say, okay, you need to transition. You can't even keep the lights on in the first place. You need to close all of those power stations that are currently running, replacing them with renewable power. And then on top of it, it employs thousands and thousands of people. You need to find alternative jobs for them. And that these are the kind of complicated challenges that people don't, fully understand. It's different in other countries. In other countries, you're finding that with adaptation, it's not just a question of adaptation, but adaptation is leading to livelihoods. So severe droughts means agricultural production is gone down. That results in droughts, that results in migrations, that results in conflict, all kinds of things that are linked to the issue of so these are some of the things that, in terms of the African or the AMSN and the AGN and the AU are confronted with. And so in terms of the negotiations, when it comes looking at these priorities, the African negotiators would structure their positions around how can we, through the process, create an enabling environment for us to be able to address that? How can we ensure that the funds that we are dealing with be able to provide us with the kind of resources for us to do what we need to do in terms of that? Not just a question of, so the just transition agenda is not just about giving me money to build a renewable plant, but also how am I supposed to support people that are not going to have jobs? How do I provide a social safety net for them? How do I then create alternative employment opportunities? And these are the kind of things that is very big in the agenda on Africa, but it also mirrors itself in many of the other countries like Latin America. And Africa sits also with a lot of problems of debt. And so, the issue of finance there is a difficult issue because the issue of finance contributes to further debt exacerbation. And when you're having debt, countries are evaluated by the rating agencies, Standard and Poor and all of these other countries, they rate the countries based on also the debt to GDP ratio. So how big your debt is in relation to your GDP, what you're producing. And the greater the debt becomes, the lower your ratings mean. And if you have lower ratings, that means you are less attractive for global investors to put money into the country. Less attractive your bonds or your whatever. If they tell countries, well, you need to start issuing green bonds and that. But if your ratings are very low, not many people are going to want to take up your bonds. And these are the kind of dilemmas that, but these intersect both with the economic and the finance agendas, and that's why today climate change, you will find it topping the list on agendas in non-climate discussions, right? So if you go to the World Economic Forum or you go to the World Bank spring meetings or fall meetings, you'll find climate always on the agenda, because the climate issue now is gone beyond just purely being an environmental issue, but it's gone to being a fundamental issue that touches on the country's financial stability, touches on the country's economic, touches on the country's ability to deal with social impacts. The more climate change you're having, the greater impacts you're having on health, and that. Does the country's health system, is it equipped to deal with that? You're having more floods, you're having more storms, you're having more emergencies, So the climate agenda has gone way beyond just being an environmental issue. That sometimes is problematic because people still look at climate purely from an environmental lens.
Right. Yeah, it's not just polar bears and penguins or whatnot, but yeah.
I mean, they are important,
yes.
But the agenda is much bigger than that.
Right, yeah. And I wanted to talk about those two words, economic growth, in a bit, but before that, can you talk about the role of the G77 and China in shaping global climate finance policies?
In the negotiations, countries don't negotiate as individual countries. You negotiate through different groupings. So the G77 is a grouping of all the developing countries. But within the grouping of the G77, you have then regional grouping. So in the G77, you will have the African Group of Negotiators, the AGN. So the AGN is all those negotiators from Africa that represents broadly the interest of Africa. And then Latin America, you would have different groupings. So you have something called Grupo Sur, which is countries, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. That you have ILAC, which is Colombia and some of those countries. The Caribbean, they have the grouping called IOSIS. Pacific Islands sometimes have their own little groupings. You have the least developed countries, or the LDCs. So all of these regional groupings, how the G77 works is the G77 is a conglomeration of all these groupings. What the G77 does is that it takes the different positions from each of those countries and consolidates it into a common developing country position. Now, not all countries will have consensus on position. So you might find that there may be some differences in African positions vis-a-vis Latin America, or that. Those are, when you have a difference they do not form part of the G77 position. So those countries, then their regional blocks. But the G77 provides a platform for all developing countries to be able to have their voice heard. If you're an individual country going, it's just one voice. But if it's the G77 speaking, it's all the developing country voices. And that gives more strength and power to those voices. So sometimes you have small countries that maybe have one delegate, or maybe 2-3 delegates cannot be in all the meetings, servers may not have the capacity, and that what the G77 does is provides a home for their issues to also be taken seriously and that's generally how. And then you would have other groupings. So the European Commission negotiates on behalf of the European Union. You have another group called the Umbrella Group, which is a combination of Australia, New Zealand, USA, Canada, and that they negotiate as a bloc. Then you would have other groupings that negotiate, like the Integrity Group. They are countries like Switzerland and that. So in the negotiations, you're negotiating in different blocs, and they're not individual countries. What is interesting to note is that the G77 is called G77 and China. So China is technically not a member of the G77, and that's why it's and China, but they do associate with the G77 countries. There are some countries that are not part of the G77, like Palau or Tuvalu, do not form part of the G77. Mexico is not a member of the G77, even though it's a developing country and with access to it. And so you have some of that anomalies, but these are bodies or groupings that actually serve as a support base for the developing countries, provides them with a platform to be able to have their voices heard, but not only voices heard, but it gives greater strength to their voice. So it's not just a small developing country saying something, but it's 100 or so developing countries saying the same. And so part of my job that time was to actually coordinate the G77. So I would be liaising with the other groups and from there formulating a common position that we would take into the negotiation.
Going into talking about economic growth, how can developing countries balance that with, sustainability while securing climate finance? Because certainly there's theories about, degrowth and, how economic growth and environmental sustainability is not compatible whatsoever.
I think you need to be pragmatic in that there's no magic bullet in that. So everything that we are doing, what the whole point of is how do you have sustainable economic growth? The reality of it is, irrespective of whether you are pro-fossil fuels or anti-fossil fuels, and that, the reality is that as we are progressing as a global community and moving forward economically, the future economic growth is going to be found in efficient products, in products that do not, and it's not just a question of it doesn't emit emissions or anything like that. But if you look at vehicles and that, as you progress, vehicles have become more and more efficient, using less fuel. The size of engines, you have electric vehicles. So in order to be able to be sustainable over that, you need to look at your economic growth models. And the economic growth models need to be looking at it not just purely from an environmental perspective, but how do I sustain this kind of economic growth? You can have short-term economic growth. Maybe, okay, well, I have some oil and I'm selling oil. But in many of the oil countries, they're already looking at the post-oil era. And you'd find that many countries are now looking at diversifying their economies to deal with the situation of the day when nobody wants to buy any more oil. How can I still generate revenue and how can I still generate economic growth? And that, so the growth model in many of the developing countries in the old days was purely on the basis of extraction industries or just mining or selling your minerals or resources and things like that. And then you're buying products from Europe or the US or Japan or China or somewhere else in the world. And that. Now you're looking at models that looking at beneficiation. How do we beneficiate the resources that we have? But also not just a question of beneficiating the resource. How can we do it in a way that is efficient, that is not harmful, that it is also sustainable over a long period of time? And in order to do that, then what is the kind of financing? What is the kind of technology? What is the kind of capacity that's needed? And I think, people also miss the point that in the negotiations, finance is just one component of the means of implementation. There are other components in means of implementation. That includes also technology and it includes capacity. How do we get the ability to get that kind of technology to actually help us do that? And that is another challenge that countries also face, because much of the technology is technology developed in areas where you end up having to pay for intellectual property or all of those kind of things. You would notice that we had the same challenge when it came time for when COVID was around. Who had the drugs? How expensive was it for developing countries to get hold of it, if they could get hold of it? And it's kind of a similar scenario. Who has the technology? And so it's not just about getting the finance but it's also getting the technology to be able to leapfrog. Otherwise, you will constantly be stuck in an economic or development model that is not fit for the world that we are living in today. And that was the idea around sustainable development, and that is that developed countries followed one model, that model led to the pollution of the earth and that. And now developing countries wanted to also develop, but they wanted to develop in a way that does not replicate that developed countries have done. And that's why the resources were supposed to have been made available to be able to have economic growth, but economic growth in a way that was sustainable. And by sustainable meaning looking at the environment, looking at the social aspects, and looking at the economic aspects. But there's no silver bullet. And, to think that it's very simplistic to say that, oh, all economic growth will be green, clean, and then you hear a lot in the media about, the green and the circular economy and all of that. Yes, they are important in that, but they don't work in all circumstances and they don't work for all people all the time. What we need to do is finding a way in which we balance. And that's why when you look at the Paris Agreement and those, you've set certain targets there. It does not talk of the complete elimination of all greenhouse gases. It does not talk of it's talking about limiting the global temperature rises to between 2 and 1.5 degrees. So it factors in also already there the notion that there will still be emissions being generated. You will not completely remove emissions altogether. As you know, cattle and sheep and all that also generate emissions through methane. If you want to completely remove all emissions, you'd have to also remove quite a bit of animals and all of those kind of things.
Yes.
I think also what we need to do is the natural course of life is such that if you look at plants, plants are absorbing CO2 and giving off oxygen. That is also the ecosystem in which the whole world operates. You cannot also just eliminate CO2 completely. What is the implication on the ecosystems if you do that? What's the implication on plants or trees or whatever that is using I think sometimes we as human beings, we always think we know better. So we do things that we feel are good, but they always have unintended consequences on the other side. And it's a bit of the Newton law type of thing of every action is an equal and opposite reaction. The big challenge is not about completely eliminating fossil fuels or completely eliminating emissions. And how do we strike a balance so that we have a balance in the earth, the levels of emissions and that, and have a balance that does not result in harmful consequences for the globe, and for the world itself.
So when COP29 was going on, there were hopes for reforms and international cooperation to add financing tools like taxation and reallocation of special drawing rights. Did that end up happening, and can you kind of go into that subject?
No, I mean, there are measures around special drawing rights and that the IMF and the others are working on, but that never factored into the negotiations on the NCQG and that. What these elements are, these are all considered to be sources of finance, right? So if you look at the NCQG decision, it says, for the goal of 300 billion for developed countries, it will come from a variety of sources. And so both public and private. So these are different ideas that people are coming up with on what could be sources for financing climate. Some come up with international taxes. Others come up with, playing around with the drawing rights. I mean, the whole issue of the special drawing rights and that it's a model used in the IMF. And the idea of the drawing rights was a mechanism in order to control the international financial world in a way in which you do not have severe shocks in that. When countries suffer from balance of payments, like let's say you're unable to pay because the money that you're getting in is less than what you're giving out, you run to the IMF because you don't want to default and become a bankrupt country. And each country is allocated drawing rights, and then you can use those drawing rights to generate money in that. It's a bit complex thing. And then they're saying, well, it's like some countries have drawing rights that they don't use. Maybe they can use that as... but these are all measures that doesn't matter what you do. There's no free money that's coming in. If you're collecting taxes, somebody has to pay the tax. If you're going to have an international tax regime, then developing countries will have to pay the tax, right? And so, everything that you do in terms of a source of money, there's no free money. The money comes with certain consequences and certain obligations and certain costs for the reality of today is that the cost for climate action is largely being borne by the poorest of countries, either in terms of the cost to mitigate and build resilience, or either the cost of having to deal with the consequences of the negative impacts of climate change. And they are the ones, why they are vulnerable is that it's not a question of just because you're vulnerable because you're going to have sea level rise or that. What they are vulnerable is that they do not have the ability to deal with such a situation. So, you can look at the difference. If you're dealing with wildfires in a small developing country, they don't have the ability of mustering firemen and planes and all of these things where you could do that in a developed country. And that's also the issue about why they are more vulnerable, because without those resources, they are bound to suffer more financial consequences of such actions. And then you find, the case of the floods in Pakistan, the cost of those floods was the conservative figure that was banded was something around $30 billion. Now put that in context, $30 billion is 1/3 of the 100 billion that was the goal for mobilizing finance for the whole developing world. We need to be much more pragmatic in the process. We tend to end up, putting people in all kinds of camps and choosing sides and that. I think at some point in time, what lacks and what the idea of multilateralism was is about the world coming collectively together to fight a common problem with all your differences that you have in that. But we tend to, put people in boxes, we put countries in boxes, and that, I hate to say it, but we are failing as a global society. And that's why, and you see the consequences of that. We have not been able to look beyond our differences. The reality of it, and I used to say it in the G77, yes, we might have some differences, but there are more things that bind us together than separate us. And we need to focus on what, binds us rather than what divides us. And that is the same adage you need to use in the climate process, and that we get very engaged in what divides us. And you see it yourself, be it the fossil fuel or be it something, that becomes the attention of the whole process, and that becomes the focus of all the action, rather than building on what brings us together collectively as a human race.
I realize we've been going on for almost more than an hour now. I just wanted to check in to see if you'd still be willing to chat for a little bit longer, because we have 3 questions left.
Let's do the 3 questions. And I will not speak so much. I'll try and be a bit more efficient in my answers.
No, I mean, I'm
passionate about what I do, so.
Yeah, no, I really do appreciate your answers though, because it's a quite difficult topic to grasp for a lot of people. So I don't know, the way you've been breaking it down has been super accessible. So transparency and accountability are very crucial for effective climate finance. What would an ideal tracking system, and let me just briefly define this again for listeners, the new collective quantified goal in climate finance, which is an agreement on, how much money the world should spend on fighting climate change, and it's a plan for how and when to allocate that money, very simplified. But what would that look like, and what challenges might arise in implementing it?
It's always difficult when it comes to transparency in that. I think at the heart of the problem is we don't have a common understanding of what climate finance is. And you would have heard that we don't have a common definition of what climate finance is, nor do we have a common accounting methodology around that. So you can have the most elaborate systems or whatever you have, but if you don't have all counting apples and all counting pears or whatever, it doesn't matter whether you have so-called transparency, you will never get a true reflection or a picture of what is going. The transparency system that you have in the UNFCCC process is a table kind of format with a whole series of questions which people have to answer. And the gap of this thing is that, one, you have an elaborate system that I doubt many developing countries would be able to implement, because they just don't have the capacity to implement that.
Yes.
You would have to track and report on everything that's happening through your budgets and what departments are spending. And if I spend X dollars, how much has been on climate and how much has been on some. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. Beyond that, the big flaw in the transparency system is that when you do review of the transparency, you're reviewing whether the people filled in the blocks. You're not reviewing the validity of the content of the block. So when they look at the transparency system, people will have to fill in information on that. And if you fill in the information, you get a tick. Yes, you've submitted, but nobody is checking actually whether the information that you've submitted in there is actually true or not true.
Sure.
I can give you an example of the OECD system on the OECD DAC. The OECD DAC is a Development Assistance Committee. To come back to this old ODA thing, they created a Development Assistance Committee in the OECD, which would track how much money countries are providing for development in relation to the 0.7%. And what they have is they call Rio markers. And Rio markers are sort of these indicators by which they measure when you report on something, does it do this? Does it do that? Does it do that? Okay, yes, it is development, or yes, it is climate and it's significant mitigation potential. And I had checked 2 projects, 2 reports, which was recognized in the OECD. I won't mention the country involved in that, but as a result of that reporting, that money that was spent, it was listed as significant mitigation potential. Now, what that means is that through that money that was spent, there was significant potential to reduce emissions. That's what it's saying, or avoiding emissions.
Yes.
But when you look at the project itself, what the project was money from a developed country flowing to an NGO, and the NGO was financing a theater group, a bunch of actors, who would go around from one farm to another to speak to farm laborers, and they would put on plays for the farm laborers to show them about what clean living is, right? How to separate your trash or something like that, which isn't bad, but that was classified as significant mitigation action. Right? Is it significant mitigation action?
Interesting.
There was another case where one country provided money to their development agency in that country, which funded a workshop that took place in that country. And yes, the workshop was dealing with the issue of climate change. But what the money actually went for was to pay the cost for a hall, catering, and stuff like that. And that was classified in the transparency system of the OECD DAC as significant mitigation potential. Another example of this would be I build an airport, or I build, as one also, of an ice cream place. I paid money to build an ice cream manufacturing place.
Oh, yes, very significant mitigation right there.
And in the course of the project, let's say I'm spending 100 million in this production process. Of the 100 million, I allocated 10 million to put solar panels on the roof.
Wow.
I can generate some money. In the reporting system, I report to them I've spent 100 million on climate, of which only 10 million was for the solar panels, but I claim the entire investment as climate. And this is what's happening. You might want to check. There was a Reuters who did an article. They took the OECD data. I think it was Stanford University that analyzed it. And the results that they found was really shocking. But nobody talks about it, or nobody wants. It talked about tide aid. It talked about money given as loans when it actually should have been grants, and reported they were funding airports and ice cream parlors and stuff like that, and claimed it was climate finance. I mean, so yes, you can have the most elaborate system in place, but if the system is not designed to interrogate the actual validity of the data, and the systems are just designed to see that you've submitted data on something or not. Because can you imagine all the countries submitting transparency reports? You can do maybe a random sample of analytical work, but it's virtually impossible. And it is impossible for developing countries because they don't have the capacity to actually do all of this kind of things. Can you imagine how much people you would need just to do a reporting system? I remember being part of one workshop where it was shown that even Japan, with all its found it very hard to actually, do that.
Oh, wow.
Japan is finding it difficult. How do you
Right.
expect? Transparency is all great and that, but in the NCQG, the transparency, they're saying the funding of the NCQG is within the context of meaningful mitigation and adaptation and transparency. What that actually means, nobody knows.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's nice words that they've been put in there. Who would determine that this is now significant mitigation, or I don't know who's going to do that. If we don't even have a definition of what climate finance is and how do you count it, I don't know who will do that. It's words that for some countries was important, so it is there in the text. Actually, they're not actually going to implement it, but it's there somewhere. And so at some point in time when you ask them, but why haven't you given finance? But it had to be in the context of significant mitigation. And in our opinion, it wasn't significant. So people find loopholes. The reality is that, and I shouldn't say this, but when you look at decisions of the negotiations, they are written with a very strong tinge of vagueness. Mm-hmm. And the vagueness is there so that each and every country can see what they want to see in there. Mm-hmm. And that's why, like 5 years down the road, we will still have arguments because somebody would say, but that was not our understanding when we said, when that decision was taken. Our understanding is different. And that's, to get consensus, you write it in a vague way. So for some people, they're seeing it as black and other people see it as white. And the language is written in such a way that it can be black or it can be white. Mm-hmm. And, that's the reality. And that's what happens also in the Paris Agreement. You hear certain countries saying, but that was not our intent when we agreed on this.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I guess, kind of wrapping down now, what advice would you give to young professionals interested in working in international climate finance or just international policy in general?
Having a proper understanding. But the proper understanding does not only just come from reading books. I think it's important speaking to people. I learned a lot more, engaging actually on the ground with people who are doing projects and that. You get a better understanding of the challenges than, sitting in a negotiation or something. I suggest for people, to open their horizons, be a sponge and absorb as much information as possible. Look at both the academic side, but look at the theoretical side. Go to the COPs and speak to people. Go to side events and listen to the lessons learned at countries. It's only through those kind of things that you don't want to replicate the same old mistakes that others. We all make mistakes, but the beauty of it is learning from those mistakes. So just be aware. Don't be swayed by fundamentalistic views about things, or it's the sexy thing to it's great but have an open mind. There are no rights and there's no wrongs. There are no villains and there's no heroes. We are all in the same boat, and if you want to go into this field, you don't have to be an environmentalist. You just have to be a passionate humanist. That's all you have to be. It's all about, at the end of the day, it's all about, caring about your fellow human beings and doing everything to empower others. And that's the beauty of what we do. I mean, we fight in the negotiations and that, but from time to time, when you actually see projects on the ground, how it's fundamentally changed people's lives and things like that, that's the reward at the end of the day, not what the NCQG figure is or how much replenishment that, that you had a part in fundamentally changing somebody's life and somebody got an education or somebody saved a life. That's the beauty of our job that we do. I can't tell you that there is a course you should take on doing this and that. I never did any course or anything like that. But I learned from my peers and I went in there. Don't be arrogant. That's the one thing. Don't be arrogant. Don't think you know it all. Go in there with the idea that I want to learn. Talk less, but say more. Don't just listen, but hear what people are saying. And I'm sure you'll make a success of it. And the world needs more people like that, particularly now. I mean, the youth are the future. At least I'm very positive when I look at the youth of today, that there are many who are committed and engaged to want to do things. And just follow your passions and do it. You're not going to change the world overnight. Like I say, that small thing that you do, maybe a very small pebble falling in a big river, but a small pebble that falls into the river creates a ripple effect, and with the ripple effect, it gets bigger and bigger, and that's what you need to do. Just sometimes, doing something small can have the ability of creating big ripples, fundamentally changing.
And I guess on that topic of youth, we are the present and the future. But if we were to turn back time, butterfly effects aside, and tell your younger self something that you've learned from life so far, what would you say to them?
I asked myself this question also. I don't think I will do anything differently. I think all the things that I did in my life, good or bad, were things that helped shape me. And you have to sometimes do the bad things to know, how to do it better the next time. And remember, I don't know, I can't remember the quote now directly, but there's always a saying, fall down 6 times and rise 7 times or something like that. And you will find that, in life, there'll always be pitfalls and things like that. But I wouldn't change my life in any way whatsoever. And that's the beauty of life, because you don't know what tomorrow brings. And who would want to live a life knowing how your life is mapped out for you? Where's the adventure? You're going to make mistakes. Don't try and, never make a mistake. It's only through mistakes that we learn. But you will do good things and sometimes not so good things, and you learn from the not so good things. And so I don't want to change anything of my life. I was lucky in my life to have parents that wanted something better for me, friends that empowered me, community that did that. And through the process, you will find that there are always people willing to help. And if I look at it, there were many people that I worked with and that helped me. And today it's my job to pass it forward. I always use the example of, somebody lit my candle, and if I light somebody else's candle, I don't lose my light. We just create greater illumination. So, enjoy life and serve a life of purpose, but enjoy life. You need a balance in life. So party if you need to party, dance if you need to dance, go out to clubs and that, but also, don't miss the balance. Maintain the yin and yang in your life. That's what life is about, and enjoy it. It's only one life you have, so live it the best you can.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. Like lighting the lights of both myself and listeners today. And, I guess to wrap up, for listeners who want to keep up with the work that you do, where can they find you?
I'm not very socially active in the social media. I post more on food I cook and things like that.
But, maybe they want to see that.
I think you'll always find me in the negotiations, and I'm part of the standing committee on finance, and I'm still involved in the negotiations, still attached to the funds and things like that. I think there's so much information about me on the internet, so it's very easy if there's specific questions or anything, I'm more than happy to try and help. You have my email address, but I don't want a flood of emails. Yes. Not that I don't want it, but
no, anybody that wishes
I want to do justice to it, and I don't want to just something which I can't deliver
for
at
sure.
the end of.
Would you be comfortable with with me directing people to my email and then forwarding them to your email?
No problem, that's fine.
Alrighty.
I don't know, if these are people that are going to the various climate meetings, like the bond sessions or the COPs and that, you won't be able to miss me, because I always wear fancy color pants and shirts and things. Just stop me. I'm more than happy to chat to anybody. You had this thing on Mandela's birthday where they called 60 minutes offer 60 minutes of my time to anybody who was interested in just having a chat. So I did that in Bonn and some other times. So if you want to, welcome to even stop me somewhere at the meetings and that, and just ask whatever you want to ask. I'm more than happy to chat to anybody.
That's great. Thank you so much again. I really, really learned a lot so much from this. So yeah.
Pleasure.